Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Exercise is Bullshit. I'm your host, Logan Emmett Hurley, and for those of you who are just listening for the first time, bullshit here stands for bodybuilding, utilizing logical lifting and scientific heuristics to inform training. I am super excited for my guest today. Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple joins us out of Canada. She's a former student from McMaster University under the tutelage of some of our favorites, including Dr. Stu Phillips. Lauren, why don't you introduce yourself, say hello, and I'd love to learn a little bit more about you.
Sure. Well, my practical background in training kind of spurred an interest in exercise science for me. And I decided to pursue a master's and subsequently a PhD. I was really interested in studying women and trying to identify sex differences if they exist. And part of the work that I've done is at the intersection between muscle physiology and female sex hormones.
That's awesome. And how did you find this interest? Like, how did you initially get into exercise science and specifically into the research area? Did you know when you first went in for your undergrad that this was something you wanted to pursue, or was it kind of sparked by maybe a class that you took or something like that?
No, actually, my undergrad degree is in psychology, and you can't do much with a psychology degree other than get another degree. So I worked in the corporate world for a while, and I just became a trainer and a group fitness instructor for fun. The gym was kind of my happy place after work. And ultimately, I left my real job and I was doing full time fitness in New York City. And I reached out to Brad Schoenfeld and asked if I could volunteer in his lab so that I could understand what it was like to do the research and help make that decision of whether I wanted to, leave that life and that career that I'd built for myself and go back to school. And I loved it, but I really wanted to study women. And actually, at the time, he didn't even have a master's program, so I couldn't have studied under him anyway. So I moved to Florida, and I got my master's with Bill Campbell at the University of South Florida in Tampa. And
Bill Campbell's great. Yeah, super smart guy.
yeah, it was a really good opportunity, and these labs they're very applied, right? So you're doing kind of training studies, you're measuring body composition, and that's very practical from someone who comes from a fitness background. But the more work I did in that arena, the more questions I had about the why behind the what, because you say, all right, well, we see muscle growth here, or we see strength gains, we see changes in body composition, but why are there differences between us as individuals and how we adapt to training, or what is really fueling these physiological changes? So I went out to Andy Galpin's lab in Fullerton for a summer where I got to do some more molecular work, looking at muscle fiber type and single fiber analysis. And ultimately, when I decided to go on to pursue a PhD, I wanted to kind of combine that experience, so more of the practical side with more of the molecular side. And as I mentioned, I was really interested in studying women. And more, when I spoke to researchers, I realized that they weren't including women because of the unknown influence of the menstrual cycle or hormonal contraceptives. And when you submit a paper to a journal in with a female population, they would say, did you account for the menstrual cycle, or did you control, which is funny, for the menstrual cycle? And so it was really from there that I said, well, we are making this huge assumption, and therefore we're kind of avoiding studying the population, but we don't even really know that it's going to make a difference and that all of this tracking would be necessary. So that really inspired some of the work that I did for my PhD.
Yeah, I think that's so awesome. That's probably the main driver of the reason why I wanted to have you on, because being involved in the science and the literature for a long time, just from the outside looking in and trying to understand what's going on with human physiology and anatomy and how to best program and train for clients and what's the best new methods that we should be doing. It's something that we saw constantly when I was reading research in my previous company was maybe they have like 5 women in a 40 group sample size. Probably not, though. It's mostly, 18 to 22-year-old college males. So women are super underrepresented in the literature. And I think it's so important to have that focus specifically on strength and hypertrophy, and if there's even a difference between the two. So I think what you're doing is just so important. And it's great to see that you've really taken the opportunity to kind of latch on to this area, because it's so funny, like in research, right? It's exactly what you're talking about with the papers. They just have this assumption that, oh, obviously the menstrual cycle or contraception is going to affect the results. And I like how you said, control the, the cycle. But how do you know? Have we actually seen data to show this? Have we actually seen scientific studies to support this idea? Because that's something I've heard basically since I've gotten into fitness, is that there's going to be differences based on the cycle. So before we dive into the topic of this paper that you were part of, and then more about the kind of misconceptions around women and strength training, one of the things I love to ask my guests on this show is, with that scientific mindset that you have, obviously, you've worked with some of the best researchers in the world. I mean, Bill Campbell, Andy Galpin, like all those are huge names in the industry. So what is something that going through this process that you've changed your mind on in, say, the last 3 to 5 years, that maybe going in, you had a pretty solid idea and understanding of this is probably the way things are. And then all of a sudden the top was blown off and you kind of had to come and change your mind just based on mounting evidence to the contrary.
I think what I see is, the more and more research that is published in women, the increasingly I think, you know what, we're actually not that different. And even though there are really interesting mechanisms to point to hypothesize differences that might play out in a practical way, it doesn't always pan out that way. And that's why we have to do the work, because it's one thing to kind of speculate based on an observed difference. But one of the key things about adaptations to exercise is that there are so many physiological changes that come along with that. And it's changes that are tangible and changes that are not so tangible. And so I think it's funny, I've done all of this work, right? But I then pull back and say, well, what does this really mean? I go back to my roots as a trainer. And I think, I never entered into a coach client relationship with a question of, well, you're a man and therefore I'm going to train you this way, or you're a woman and therefore I'm going to train you this way. And so I think what's happened in social media is a lot of that's original speculation has now sort of become fact, and people will say, you need to eat differently, or you need to train differently, or you should never do this, or you should always do that. And that's really contrary to the evolution of the science. And so it's a long-winded way of saying, I don't think that I went in to this really expecting one outcome or another. I really was genuinely curious about these differences and learning more about female physiology. And I wouldn't really have been that surprised either way if we'd found something, at the muscle level or at the molecular level. But I'm not that surprised that we don't see it play out in a practical way, because that wasn't my lived experience as somebody who was lifting and training others.
Yeah, such a great point, and perfectly obviously segues into the conversation today. Can you, and you painted a little bit of this picture already, and how we kind of talk in our industry specifically in absolutes with things that maybe shouldn't be talked about in an absolute sense. Can you, I'm sure part of your research has been sort of seeing where this sort of philosophy of training men and women differently has come from. Can you tell us, maybe paint a picture of a little bit of the background of this topic, some of those potential mechanisms, the idea of hormone fluctuations created by taking birth control, how these things might hypothetically affect gains in the gym, and why this has become such a kind of part of the zeitgeist when it comes to training?
Well, it's interesting because when I reflect on our collective journey with testosterone over the years, there was a time at which everyone seemed to think like testosterone's the end all be all of hypertrophy. And there were even training recommendations about, oh, you should be doing this rep range to really like boost your testosterone in that individual workout, right? And then increasingly started to realize, well, turns out that it's not your testosterone levels. The normal range is a very broad range, and we're not seeing that being on the higher or lower end of that range is actually predictive of your propensity to gain muscle size and strength. And so it really only seems to be an important factor during puberty, when that initial surge in testosterone is accompanied by an increase in muscle mass in men. And then, of course, when we get outside that normal range, then of course it can make a meaningful difference. But it's interesting to me that we've come full circle on that, and then it seems like we're kind of doing it again, but with the female hormones, because we see, well, testosterone can't be the thing if, relatively speaking, men and women are gaining similar muscle, relative to their starting point. So then it begs the question, would estradiol, progesterone, would those be contributing factors? And there are some interesting animal models that kind of underpin some of this speculation, and that looks at what happens when the hormones are absent. So if you remove the ovaries from a rodent, you shut down hormone production, you shut down reproductive function. And what has been observed in some of those models is that the rodent's ability to maintain muscle mass is compromised when there are no longer those normal hormone levels. And so that really fuels the hypothesis that there's some sort of connection here between those hormones and muscle. And when in subsequent trials, when they were injecting the rodent with a synthetic estradiol, they were able to kind of return to those baseline levels of muscle mass. So this is a very interesting model. These are interesting findings, and it makes sense why this would be the basis to hypothesize some relationship. But some key differences here is we're saying the total absence of the hormones had that effect. That's not something that we see in human physiology, because during the menstrual cycle, we have hormone fluctuations. And even during the menopause transition, it's a gradual decline with some really erratic fluctuations along the way. And when we think about the absence of something being problematic, that doesn't mean that the presence or short-term changes are going to have a meaningful effect.
Yeah, that was a really articulate answer there, and got me thinking, especially as you were talking about the animal models, right? Like, how do we equate one to one when you're talking about completely removing the ovaries versus the normal human fluctuations that you would see over the course of the menstrual cycle? So, what are some of the assumptions that you've seen made, just kind of combing through maybe different literature or feedback that you've received, maybe from different research entities, as far as like publishing companies, for why they maybe thought that women wouldn't be as adequate of test subjects as men because of some of these mechanisms and things that were happening?
Well, it's really just a general, I don't know, fear or expectation that there might be a difference. And the fact that you can say, oh, well, men are consistent, and so we can test them at any time. And we know that's not going to be a confounding variable. And in research, we're trying to reduce as much variability as possible, right? We want to control for as many factors as we can. Of course, when you think about a cell culture model or an animal model, you have extreme control because they're there. You can monitor them all day long. You feed them everything. You've control for physical activity, and you can't do that in human subjects. And so there's already going to be some kind of inherent variability that we have to accept in human clinical trials. But the assumption that there would be a difference really isn't based on much evidence that there is. It's just the assumption that because you didn't standardize everything, then we've introduced additional variability, and that takes away from the quality of the data.
Yeah, totally understand that. And it's funny too, because whenever I read, papers about 40 college age males or whatever that say they're training 3 days a week, and then all of a sudden for one study, they only did one, set of leg extension for 5 weeks. It's like, did they though? Like, how do you know that you're controlling for all these other factors outside? And we're just kind of hoping that the people who are participating in all this are actually following their food logs. They're not taking other exogenous supplements. They're, not training more than they're supposed to be. So we're putting a lot of faith in the process of like 18 to 22-year-olds that we maybe shouldn't be, but then we're excluding almost this entire group because there could potentially be some variables that we're not really sure if are even affecting things. So it's just, talking to you about that, it seems kind of ironic that we're, excluding one group altogether for the hypotheticals, but then just taking all these people at their word that they're not doing anything outside of these studies. So
That's right. And you know what? When we, especially in exercise science, we certainly allow for a lot of that, right? Because very few studies are actually controlling what people are eating. Food logs, we know, are not great. Um, and even things like an age range, right? If we say, okay, we're recruiting 18 to 30, there is a difference between an 18-year-old and a 30-year-old. If we say, oh, we're recruiting, quote unquote, trained subjects, they're not equally trained. And so we kind of accept that all of these things are all right. And for whatever reason, that the menstrual cycle or oral contraceptives don't fall into one of those categories that it is just sort of accepted in this type of study.
yeah, that's a great point too, and one I didn't bring up, but the well trained being like over 12 months of continuous training 2 times a week or whatever. It's like, well, you might have somebody who's been training since they were 10, and somebody who just started last year, and is following some not so great program or whatever it might be. So that's another really good point. Let's dive into this paper a little bit, and the one we're going to be discussing today was the oral contraceptive pill phase does not influence muscle protein synthesis or myofibrillar proteolysis at rest or in response to resistance exercise. Probably screwed some of those words up, but tell me a little bit about the impetus specifically for this paper as why you wanted to test these markers and things that you decided to do in the course of it.
Yeah, so this was kind of a sister study to the menstrual cycle phase work that I did. And the goal here is to look at these different hormone profiles and then say, okay, people will speculate that this might be quote unquote anabolic or this might be quote unquote catabolic. And how do we measure that? We measure muscle protein synthesis and breakdown because that is anabolism and catabolism in a muscle context. So when we think about oral contraceptives, we are essentially shutting down the fluctuations that we would see in a natural menstrual cycle and introducing these exogenous hormones at low doses such that we have a really consistent profile when you're taking the pill. So that's typically 21, 24 days. And then we remove the hormones for the 4 to 7 days, depending on the pill you're on. And in that week or so that you're off the pill, would there be changes that might affect how the muscle is going to respond to exercise? And then once we kind of pull back and we can look at the naturally cycling folks compared to the women who are on the pill. And so in this paper, we looked at the subjects in the second week of the pill phase, the active hormone phase, and we used metabolic tracers, deuterium, along with muscle biopsies, and we assessed at rest and then in response to exercise. So we would expect an elevation in protein synthesis in response to exercise, and we did observe that. And then we repeated that measurement in the week that they were off the pill. And again, same methods there. And then we compared each woman to herself, right? So each participant went through the protocol twice, once in each phase. And we did observe that anticipated increase in protein synthesis in response to exercise, but we did not observe any differences between that active pill phase and the pill-free or placebo pill phase.
So we can assume from that, then I would get, or at least try to make the assumption that if somebody's not on the pill and they're going through those normal fluctuations, that they would expect to see the normal levels of NPS regardless of where they were in their cycle. Is that kind of what you were hoping to find, or?
Well, really, this was about testing in a different hormone profile, because
Gotcha.
with in the context of the menstrual cycle, and in that study I looked at the week where estradiol is highest, or that the week kind of surrounding that peak, to test the hypothesis of estrogen being anabolic, because that's really what has been proposed based on those animal studies, and then repeated that in the phase where progesterone is highest, and that has been kind of proposed to be catabolic, and we didn't see differences there. So really, same study design, same methods, and as anticipated, we see an increase in response to exercise, but there were no differences in these fairly extremely different hormone profiles. And so that was really the purpose of that study. And so now, to look at it in oral contraceptive users, we're saying, okay, now we don't have any of these fluctuations that we're observing in those with a menstrual cycle, because if you're on an oral contraceptive, you no longer have a menstrual cycle, you no longer have those endogenous hormone fluctuations. And would there be a difference in that context? And again, there wasn't.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Totally makes sense. As far as the testing method you used, I had Alicia D'Souza on the show a couple months back. Was that the similar testing method for MPS? Were you guys using that COSIAM method, or was it a different marker that you were tracing for the MPS?
Yeah, so essentially the tracer, which is an oral tracer, allows you to measure the incorporation into the muscle biopsy that you take. And so we take one before they consume that tracer, and then we take one after they've consumed the tracer, and at rest and during exercise. So one from each leg. Essentially, they were doing single leg extension, so that we could measure within the same person the effect of the phase and the effect of the hormones, and also the effect of exercise, because we know there are differences between individuals. So this is a really tightly controlled design to kind of remove those differences between, because we're just comparing you to you. And essentially, that orally ingested tracer can be topped up over time. So it allows for a measurement of muscle protein synthesis that kind of encompasses everything else that you're doing throughout that week or throughout that month. And as opposed to a tracer method where you're hooked up to an IV and we're just assessing it over a period of hours. So you'll read papers like that, and the that the limitations of that are, it's no longer free living. It's just you, usually in a fasted state, hooked up to an IV over a number of hours. And so it's a good method to say, okay, let's then have you consume protein, or let's have you exercise, and we can do this in a tightly controlled lab setting. But when we use the orally ingested tracer, then you're just drinking it in the morning and then you're going about your day. So it includes all of your feeding and sleeping and overall physical activity. And so in that way, it's a bit more of an ecologically valid measure.
Yeah, I love that, and that's super helpful and clarifying as well. And just a little bit more about the structure of the study. I believe there were 12 participants, and then, like you mentioned, they were doing unilateral leg extension. Were they doing that on the same day for each leg and measuring, or were they switching back and forth over the course of the study period based on different phases? Like, how was the structure set up there? And then for listeners that don't know, that inter-subject design that you're talking about, that inter-subject crossover, is a super ecologically valid way of doing it for that exact reason you mentioned, because you get so much variability between different participants. So to actually compare you to you at different times, as opposed to you to somebody else that has completely different genetics than you.
Yeah, I know exactly. And we always see this really in everything we measure when we plot individual data points. You'll see there are some people who just are lower or higher responders to a particular intervention, and that kind of removes that piece of it when we do these types of within subject designs. So they came in one phase, and that was randomized. Which phase was the first? And then there was an exercise leg for that phase, and then they came back, a month later, 2 months later, and repeated it. And the opposite leg was the exercise leg in that second phase trial.
Gotcha. That totally makes sense. Yeah, just wanted to clarify that as well. And then were you doing any sort of body composition testing as well, or was it purely just like MPS? Were you
We
doing DEXA
did
or
we
anything to
did
measure?
DEXAs. Just, I mean,
Okay,
we do that kind of standard.
got it.
And we also used, maybe you discussed this with Alicia, the D3 creatine method for muscle mass. So
Yep,
we
that's
did
yeah,
that as well. And the last piece of that was a different tracer to measure protein breakdown, and that was done sort of the tail end of the week of each phase. So it's, and then that's measured in the blood, and then of course we measure blood hormones
got
along the
it.
way as well to actually confirm that the hormone profile was what we expected.
So the higher progesterone versus the higher estrogen levels, kind of thing.
Correct. And
Okay.
prior to the start of the study, we tracked cycles and tracked ovulation using urine test strips for several cycles because um, I wanted to, but the way to capture that high estradiol peak is by starting a week prior to anticipated ovulation.
Gotcha.
Um, and then for the high progesterone, it was just to start a week after that peak. So it's tricky. And, one of the biggest takeaways was how much we see differences in woman to woman, cycle to cycle, because there's so much variability. And so it's funny now that I see these cycle syncing programs, and
Yeah.
I think even if they were effective, they just don't account at all for the fact that some people have 3 week long cycles and some people have
Yeah.
5 week long cycles, and ovulation can kind of occur anywhere in the middle.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. And again, like trying to find a one size fits all package for somebody that you can sell them so they feel more comfortable about the potential outcomes that they're going to receive. So, as far as the outcomes for this paper, did you in your group hypothesize that there were going to be no difference? And did you have any reason for that going into the paper? And then were you surprised by the outcomes of the study? Was it exactly what you expected? Were there any like crazy outliers? I know you mentioned basically on the whole, everybody experienced MPS because of those major fluctuations between all the participants. Was there somebody who maybe did not? And was there any significance to their estrogen or estradiol levels or progesterone levels, or any other interesting findings, I guess?
One thing that's super interesting is just the blood hormone measurements, because I just mentioned that the timing of those fluctuations can differ a lot between women. But the other thing is the magnitude of those fluctuations can really, really vary. So if you look at this diagram of menstrual cycle hormone fluctuations, it's a very kind of pretty picture with two big peaks. And in real life, very few graphs actually look like that for real women. And so some people have just small peaks, and some people do have much larger ones, but there was no relationship between those higher hormone folks and body composition or strength or anything kind of practical. And the other interesting finding here is the anticipation of thinking, oh well, there's going to be somehow a greater response here, and therefore we should train harder. That's really what the kind of social media version of this is, to say this is your follicular phase, estrogen is going to be highest, estrogen is anabolic, and therefore we should lift weights, we should increase the intensity. And on the flip side, in the luteal phase, progesterone is high, progesterone is catabolic. So we should really decrease the intensity, maybe not even lift at all, and really focus on recovery and, do some yoga, do some light stretching. That's sort of the template that's been put out there. And the data really does not support that narrative at all. And so it's really frustrating that it sort of continues to be perpetuated despite the evidence.
Yeah, unfortunately, it seems like it takes the evidence like 10 years to catch up with the common, zeitgeist on everything. So, I was just anecdotally, I was at a friend of mine owns a home gym equipment company. So I was helping him a few weeks ago in Louisville. There was like a big home gym convention. And I was talking to Milo Wolf probably 4 years ago about like length and partials. And he was the only one that was kind of doing that and experimenting with it. And literally every person that came up on the leg extension that my buddy had was trying to like lay back on it and like, oh, can you fit a pad here so we can go further into the stretch? And so it was like, so that was a 4 year kind of gap between he was talking about it, the research was kind of pointing to it, and then now like the average person is talking about it. So hopefully with all the work you're doing now, maybe by 2030 we'll have no more pill programs sold online. I'm just wondering with your kind of experience here and all the data you've seen so far, do you think there would be any impact or differences between other generations of contraception, whether it's an intrauterine device or somebody's got the patch or whatever it might be? Do you expect or would you expect that there would be any difference in training outcomes because of those?
I think it's unlikely. The reality is, um, when we think of those generations, it comes down to decreasing the quantity of the hormone that is still going to be effective as a birth control. And so early birth control pills had pretty high doses of hormones. And then over time, it was okay, we can probably reduce. And then the generation itself is the type of synthetic progesterone or progestin that is used in the pill. And there are some people who've speculated that, oh, well, maybe this would be, more anabolic or catabolic, or be based on the makeup of this. Is it a more androgenic type progestin? But when we look at people who are lifting weights over time on or off hormonal contraceptives, we really don't see a difference. There are a couple of papers that show that being on the pill was beneficial for muscle growth and strength gains. There are a couple of papers that show it was detrimental for muscle growth or strength gain. But in either direction, the effects are so small that it's really not something that I would be very concerned about. We don't have a lot of data on the more modern, like the IUDs, but again, those are very low dose, and you're getting a very kind of consistent release of hormone in the way that it's not as consistent with the pill unless you're taking it at the exact same time every single day religiously. So I don't think we would see much of a difference. And a lot of the messaging I see online, which is sort of fear-based messaging around contraceptives, I think is really, really unwarranted, because so many elite athletes use them just for convenience. And whenever we talk about hormonal contraceptives, it's important to acknowledge that, they are, the primary purpose is as a birth control. And so, but by kind of discouraging people from using that for fear that, it might interfere with your gains, is just a message that, again, it's not evidence-based. And I think it's a bit irresponsible the way I see some people put that out there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Are there any other specific avenues kind of wrapped around contraception specifically, or just women's training and how those hormonal fluctuations might affect it, that you'd like to explore, that you're currently exploring in this area?
Yeah, I mean, the most interesting in my opinion, is the menopause transition, because then we're seeing that gradual decline. There's a lot of changes in body composition that we don't fully understand. There are estrogen based mechanisms that you might point to say, oh, there are there's weight gain in about 60 to 70% of women, but it's slow weight gain. But then there's also some kind of body fat redistribution in some individuals. And is that because of the reduction in hormones over the menopause transition? And if we look to menopause hormone therapy, right now we know it's very effective for menopause related symptoms, but it doesn't seem to be very effective for muscle. And there's not great evidence that it's very effective for changing body fat, but we have very little data in women who are physically active. And so I think that's a really interesting population to explore. There's a lot of interesting questions to answer, but I mentioned how tough it is to do this work, even just with the menstrual cycle, because of the differences between people and all of the tracking that you need to do. And then you're still kind of making a prediction at the end of the day, and maybe you're not quite spot on. It's tough. And when we look at people who are going through the menopause transition, it's even tougher, because you don't necessarily, the transition isn't the same length of time for some women. The hormonal fluctuations you might experience along the way are very different. Some people have symptoms, some people don't. Some people experience body composition related changes, other people don't. So it's kind of a mess from a research perspective, because like I said, we're trying to reduce all that variability, right? But then we need to study this population that is super variable.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, and I hope you're able to continue to look in that direction, because that's a huge portion of the clients that I have. Is our company tends to target older women, probably in that pre to perimenopausal, maybe even postmenopausal age, and it can be extremely frustrating for them, as I'm sure you know. But obviously, there's so many variables to control. It's when somebody comes to you and they're like, "I'm gaining weight and I don't know what to do about it." It's like, yeah, okay, but there's probably so many other factors that we need to focus on and figure out first. So let's see if we can control some of those things and not just blame everything on menopause. But you also don't want to dismiss that completely, because there are so many changes happening. And some people don't feel it at all, like you said, and some people just feel like shit all the time. So, if young women are underrepresented in research, I feel like menopausal women are like non-existent almost, at least in the strength and hypertrophy research that I've seen. So I hope you guys continue to look in that area. As far as implications and biggest takeaways from this study for someone who's maybe using an oral contraceptive, what would you kind of advocate for them if maybe they've been thinking about doing one of those, hormone syncing programs, or like what would be some big actionable takeaways that they could use for their own programming potentially going forward?
Well, I think the decision to be on an oral contraceptive or any other type of hormonal contraceptive, really, you shouldn't worry about the effect on performance or the effect on any kind of exercise induced adaptation. It's going to have a really negligible effect, if any. There are some forms of contraception that some women will go on and have kind of bad side effects from. And so you might need to go through a couple iterations to find one that you can tolerate well. I'd say that's one of the key considerations. But once you have found that, then I really wouldn't be concerned about it interfering with performance. When it comes to menstrual related symptoms, I think it's good that people are having conversations about the menstrual cycle for that reason. But I really encourage people to treat those the same way you would if you just weren't feeling well. And so have some component of autoregulation in your program. Every good program should, for a variety of reasons. And that's true no matter your sex or age.
And what would you say to coaches or clients that are maybe still trying to time their workouts around their oral contraceptive pill and their cycle?
This is one of many examples of overcomplicating fitness for women. And I see it around the menstrual cycle. I see it around hormonal contraceptives. I see it around menopause. I see it with, pre and post workout nutrition recommendations. There's so much out there that is making exercise so much more complicated for women. And this has some really big downsides, because if you're constantly focusing on things that don't really matter or switching things up to align with a perceived hormone profile, then you're removing consistency, which is one of the key components to any successful fitness program. And we need to go back to the basics and remember what matters and what is going to help us reach our goals. And I think a lot of these trendy programs and trendy messages are actually pushing women away from just effective training.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice, and just a really good point to advocate to people who are maybe struggling and thinking like this isn't working for me, because they maybe tried a plan that hasn't worked and maybe they just need to be consistent for a while, right? Like program switching is a major part of our industry, and I think it really has a detrimental impact on people and their progress over the long term. So I just kind of want to wrap this up with you, Lauren, because I'm sensitive to your time. Just big takeaways for me is your oral contraceptive probably isn't affecting your gains, at least not in the way you think. If you or your coach are trying to plan training phases around your cycle or your pill, it's probably a waste of time. If you're not seeing results while you're on the pill, it's possible your programming isn't the best, or maybe if you've been training consistently for a really long time, you're just approaching your natural limit. If you've been consistent and working really hard for a long time and you think that, oh my gosh, I need to hop off this pill because now I've peaked out. It's probably, look back at your training records and see how much progress have you made. Do you look great? Well, you might just be close to where you need to be. Any other thoughts or kind of major takeaways from you in this paper specifically, and just maybe other areas of research that we could expect coming out in the next few months, years, things like that as well?
Yeah, I just want to touch on this claim that women are really underrepresented in the exercise science literature and the resistance training literature. It's true, but it's less true than it used to be. And so I think some people use that as a way to pitch something to women that isn't true. So it's, well, we have no idea what it would apply in women, and we can't use this data from men. So here's my recommendation, based on nothing or pure speculation. And that's a problem. Um, as I said earlier in our conversation, the more data that comes out where studies that were originally conducted in men are now being replicated in women, the more we're seeing very similar data. And so when it comes to the basics that work for muscle growth, strength gains, sports performance, fat loss, the same principles apply to both sexes. And so anything that is trying to just confuse or overcomplicate fitness because you are a woman is noise. And I think we really need to remember to train the individual, and or if you're training yourself, then focus on something that is goal specific, appropriate, and sustainable for you. And don't lose sight of that big picture and those basic building blocks, those training principles that we know apply. Because when it comes to biological sex, we really are not seeing that many differences between, all men and all women. We see differences, but they're between individuals. And so you need to find a program that is going to work for you. And then we need to progress it over time and stay consistent.
Yeah, I love that. That's fantastic advice. And then the only thing I would add is, switching to find the optimal program based on your hormones is probably not going to work for you, but switching to find a program that suits you as an individual, not wrapped around your hormones, I think is a great idea, because some people do respond better to a little higher rep training. Some people do respond better to heavier weights. But I think experimenting in that realm, as opposed to trying to optimize the hormonal factor, is probably going to do more for you in the long term and staying consistent than anything else. Lauren, if people have questions for you or anything, how can they reach out to you and maybe ask you something or ask about some of your research? Or is there Twitter, Instagram, any of that you want to share?
Yeah, you can reach out on Instagram. It's Dr. Lauren CS1.
Awesome. Dr. Colenso-Semple, this was great. I really appreciate you taking the time today. You're brilliant. I'm excited to see all the other stuff that you come up with in this area. And I think it's much needed. And it's, hopefully, like I said, by 2030, everybody will be singing your praises and you won't ever have to where you can focus on something else. And now menopausal women by 2040 will be safe because of you. So thank you so much for taking the time today. I really, really appreciate your expertise and your, just sharing your thoughts and your wisdom with us. So thank you so much for taking the time. Thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back in a couple weeks and we'll see you again soon.